She was curled near the wagon wreck, barefoot and half-conscious. One arm pressed to her ribs like they hurt too much to move. The cloth around her legs was torn, dusty, soaked from the knees down. Old Trapper didn't ask where her people were. He saw the splintered wood, the bloody handprint smeared across the broken wheel, and the tracks leading off. Apache raiders, maybe. Or just men worse than that. He knelt beside her, pulled his blanket from the saddle roll, and wrapped it around her shoulders. She didn't flinch, just blinked at him with sunburned eyes. Maybe 10 years old, maybe less. Her lips were cracked, face wind-chapped. He poured a bit of water from his canteen into his hand and let her drink from his palm like a wounded fawn, too scared to trust a cup. She said nothing. He didn't expect her to. He lifted her slowly. She weighed less than the pack on his mule. Setting her sideways in the saddle, he tied her gently with rope, arms wrapped tight. The mule didn't protest. They started south, feet crunching over the scattered gravel, past the bloodstains that had already started to darken in the dust. 3 miles down the pass, her breathing turned shallow. He stopped under a ledge, cleared a spot, and kindled a fire from dry mesquite he kept in a leather pouch. Firewood too precious to waste, but wasted anyway. The wind scraped the canyon like a whisper with teeth. She coughed, then closed her eyes, trembling. He tucked the blanket tighter around her face, covered her fingers with his own until her shivering slowed. His scarf came off next, then the gloves. The cold crept into his bones without protest. Before dawn, her eyes opened. "Are you him?" she whispered. He frowned. "Who?" "Mama said someone would come," she said, barely audible. "Not a soldier, not a priest. A quiet man with sad eyes." He stirred the fire, said nothing, handed her the last strip of dried venison. She didn't eat much, but held it like something sacred. They moved again before the frost lifted. He walked, she rode, her breath fogged in the morning air. His hands bled where the wind had cracked them. By noon, they reached Dry Mesa Crossing. A rancher's boy spotted them and ran to fetch someone. The girl was lifted down, carried into a stone house. No one looked back at the man by the fence, face cracked, fingers stiff and raw. They gave her hot broth, a bed, a woman to sit by her side. Someone said they'd bury the rest of her family come spring thaw. Someone else whispered that the man who found her had disappeared. He hadn't. He'd walked away before they could ask his name. That night, snow fell. Not common, but heavy. The sky opened like a torn sack, and the wind howled through the canyons. The girl, warm under his old blanket, woke once and thought she saw him through the window, standing beneath the trees. Not knocking, not asking for thanks. By morning the wind had died, and a ranch hand found him beneath the juniper stand, sitting with his back against the trunk, eyes closed, palms up, like he'd been holding something. The mule stood nearby, waiting. In his lap was a strip of cloth, torn from his own coat, used to bind a crack in the girl's boot. His hat had blown off sometime during the night and lay a few feet away, half buried in the snow. His knife was still on his belt, untouched. They buried him near the ridge without much ceremony. No cross, just a pile of stones, and the mule tied to a post nearby, refusing food for days. The girl recovered. She stayed on the ranch that winter. Come spring, she walked alone up the ridge with a ribbon she'd found in a drawer. She tied it to the juniper tree. No one asked why. Years later, she still remembered how he hadn't said much, just wrapped the blanket around her and walked. Step after step, cold seeping through his bones, without asking who she was or what it would cost. Not a soldier, not a priest. A quiet man with sad eyes, and hands warm enough to carry her back from the edge. The mule wouldn't leave the grave. Days passed. The ranch hands tried grain, then apples, then ropes. Nothing moved it. When they pushed too hard, the animal simply lowered its head and braced against the ground like stone. The girl watched from the porch. She didn't speak. She hadn't spoken since the burial. Mrs. Callahan, the rancher's wife, told her to rest, brought her warm soup and clean socks. But the girl always ended up near the window, eyes fixed on the tree line. "She thinks he's still out there," Mrs. Callahan told her husband. "She saw him freeze, May. She didn't see him leave." The ribbon still hung from the branch, snapping in the breeze. And every morning, Clara stepped outside just far enough to look up at it. She didn't touch it, didn't speak to it, just looked, like it might still hold some of his warmth. Her name was Clara. Her father had been a wagon driver between Alamogordo and Silver City, hauling hides and dry goods. When he was killed, whoever killed him, the details didn't survive. Only Clara and a patch of torn fabric did. Her mother had died the winter before, giving birth to a child that never took a breath. Since then, Clara had been quiet, alert, the kind of child who sat without moving for hours and noticed every door that opened. She didn't cry. Old Trapper had carried her through the pass, had said nothing, and she matched him in silence. Now she mirrored his stillness, as if speaking would scatter whatever fragile thing had kept her alive. She refused to let the blanket go. Mrs. Callahan offered others, heavier, newer, but she clung to the worn one, the one with threadbare edges and the faint smell of pine smoke. "Some things don't warm your skin," the woman murmured to herself, watching Clara sleep. "They warm something else." On the third morning, a Mescalero scout came down from the ridge. He rode a dun-colored horse and carried a rifle across his back. His hair was braided with rawhide strips, and he wore a blue kerchief around his neck. He introduced himself as Natani, said nothing else at first. When he saw Clara on the porch, he stopped speaking altogether. After a long silence, he said, "She's the one from the wagon." Mrs. Callahan nodded. "He brought her in the storm." Natani looked toward the mule. "It was him," he said quietly. "The quiet one. The one they called Wolf Brother." Mrs. Callahan frowned. "Old Trapper?" Natani gave a nod of respect. "He saved my sister once, long ago, when others hunted her for leaving the mission school. He gave her food, never said his name. I don't think he ever did. He had many." Later that day, Natani returned with a wrapped bundle. Inside, a pair of worn moccasins, a coil of braided sinew, and a pouch with cedar ash. "He gave us these long ago, said they'd be needed again." Mrs. Callahan looked at him. "And now? Now they belong to her." That evening, Natani stayed to mend a saddle. Clara came and sat beside him without being asked. She watched his hands work the leather. "Did you know him?" she asked softly. "He didn't stop working." "Not really, but I saw him once, in the canyon. He gave my brother a knife." "Why?" "Because we were hungry." Clara looked down. Natani reached into his pouch and pulled something small, a wooden carving of a bird, rough, old. He handed it to her. "He gave us this too. Said it was for remembering, not for trading." Clara turned it over in her hands. Her fingers trembled, just barely. "Why did he help people?" she asked. "Because he didn't always," Natani said, tightening the strap. "Because there were things he never said sorry for. This was his way." Neither of them spoke for a while. The fire cracked. Somewhere beyond the field, a coyote called once and went quiet. That night, Clara left the ribbon tied in the tree, but she placed the carving at the base of the stones, pressed it into the dirt with both palms. She whispered something no one heard, then walked back slowly. The mule stayed by the grave, and the wind shifted, just enough to rattle the ribbon. Not with violence, but like someone brushing past it softly, as if telling her the journey hadn't ended, only turned quiet. Clara began waking before dawn, not from nightmares, but from the quiet. She'd step onto the porch barefoot, the blanket draped over her shoulders like skin, and look toward the ridge. The mule stood nearby, still guarding the stones. No one had the heart to move it. Even the ranch hands began walking around the grave instead of past it, like the space held something that shouldn't be disturbed. Each morning, she whispered a word before going back inside. Not in English, not Spanish. Mrs. Callahan didn't ask what it meant. A week passed. Snow lingered on the northern slope, crusted and hard. A letter arrived from the military post at Fort Stanton. They wanted a full account of the wagon incident, who was involved, what was taken, whether hostiles were responsible. Mr. Callahan crumpled the paper and threw it in the stove. "They're always late," he muttered. "Always too late for the ones that matter." Clara was sitting in the corner. She didn't flinch, didn't look up, but her grip on the carving in her lap tightened. "Mrs. Callahan placed a hand on her shoulder. "They want names, child." But he didn't leave one. Clara said, barely above a whisper. He left enough. That afternoon, a stranger arrived. He rode a fine black horse and wore a cavalry coat, though he hadn't shined the buttons. His boots were polished, but his eyes were dull. Not dead, just empty, like a man who'd long ago stopped expecting warmth. He dismounted without speaking, tied his horse, and approached the porch. Clara stood before anyone else could. The man looked at her, then at the blanket around her shoulders. Something in his jaw shifted. "I came to see him," he said. Mrs. Callahan stepped out. "He's gone." The man nodded slowly, then turned his gaze to the mule by the grave. "Still there?" "Yes." He took off his hat, ran a hand through close-cropped hair. "I served with him once, a long time ago, before he quit wearing the uniform." Clara took a step forward. "What was he like, and then?" The man looked surprised, not at the question, but at hearing her voice. "He was fast, hard, didn't flinch. Some said he didn't have blood in him, only fire and rust." "Why'd he leave?" The man paused. "He disobeyed an order. Said it wasn't right. Said he wouldn't burn down a place full of children just because someone said they might grow up to be enemies." Mrs. Callahan drew a breath. "They stripped him of rank. He didn't argue, just walked off. Took his blanket and disappeared." Clara said nothing. The wind brushed past, and the man looked out toward the trees. "I was one of the men who gave the order." No one moved. He stepped off the porch, crossed to the grave, stood there for a while, not speaking. The mule watched him but didn't move. After a long minute, he took something from his coat, a silver medal dulled with age, and placed it at the foot of the stones. Then he turned and left. No farewell. Just the sound of hooves and the long shadow he left behind. That night, Clara sat with Natani near the fire again. Was he angry? No, the scout said. He was tired. Did he believe in anything? Yes, Natani said, tying off a length of sinew. That some things are worth more than survival. She didn't speak again until the fire had burned low. Did he forgive? Natani looked into the flames. He gave his blanket to a girl, then died in the cold. If that isn't forgiveness, I don't know what is. They sat in silence. The fire popped once. Clara reached for the pouch Natani had brought days ago. She opened it and sprinkled a small pinch of cedar ash into the flames. The scent rose, sharp and ancient, the kind used in mescalero ceremony, not for cleansing, but for remembering. The flames danced brighter, just for a moment. She didn't smile, but her shoulders eased. Outside, the ribbon on the branch moved again, not with wind, but with something softer. The mule, still unmoved by the cold, closed its eyes. And for the first time, Clara stepped outside without the blanket. Just her hands, bare, resting on the stone pile, not seeking heat, but saying, "I'm here." Spring came late to the ridge. Snow melted in patches, slow and stubborn. The creek behind the house began to move again, trickling beneath thin plates of ice. Clara spent her mornings by the stones now, brushing off pine needles, rearranging pebbles. Not decoration, just habit. The way someone straightens a collar or folds cloth twice instead of once. The mule still stood close, no longer guarding but choosing not to leave. Sometimes it slept standing. Sometimes it lowered itself beside the stones and rested with its eyes half closed, as if watching something the others couldn't see. Mrs. Callahan had written a second letter, this one not to the fort, but to a trading post outside Mescalero land. She asked if anyone remembered a man who once gave a child a knife, or carried ash, or carved birds from wood. She didn't expect an answer. But the next wagon brought back a message scrawled in charcoal on a torn ledger page. He is not forgotten. His shadow walks beside the wind. Clara had begun to speak again, slowly, in pieces. Not about what happened, but about things like how the mule leaned when the wind shifted, or how pine cones cracked louder after a hard frost. Natani noticed. He came more often, never with ceremony, just with stories that started in the middle and ended without warning. They sat near the barn. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. One morning he handed her a small knife, bone-handled, old. It was his. Clara turned it over in her hands. The blade was thin but well kept. The handle worn smooth where fingers had rested. She didn't ask how he'd gotten it, just held it, like it mattered. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you remember." That evening she carved her first bird. It was crude, misshapen and splintered in places, but she placed it under the same tree where the ribbon still hung, and said nothing, just pressed it into the ground the way he had done with her blanket. Word began to spread. Travelers passing through the mesa stopped to ask about the man with no name who gave his coat to a child. An old woman brought tobacco leaves and placed them on the grave. A miner left a coin. A Chiricahua woman set down a bundle of sage wrapped in deer hide. A preacher stopped once, asked who the man was. Mrs. Callahan said, "He never gave a name, only his warmth." The preacher blinked, took off his hat, and left a page torn from his own Bible, folded once, set beneath a stone. It was Psalm 91. Mr. Callahan once muttered, "Didn't speak 5 words in 5 years, and now the whole desert remembers him." To which Mrs. Callahan replied, "Silence leaves room for remembering." Clara kept the knife in a pouch at her side, not for use, for weight. She sometimes sat beside the tree for hours, not carving, just holding the wood. Sometimes she would place a finger on the ribbon, let it twist around her hand. Not like a game, more like she was feeling for a pulse that hadn't stopped, only changed. Then one day, a boy came alone. He was maybe 13, dark-eyed and thinner than the wind. His boots were torn and he carried a satchel made from a feed sack. He said nothing when he arrived, just looked at Clara, then the grave, then sat beside the mule and waited. Natani came that afternoon and found them both sitting in silence. The boy nodded once toward the tree. "I had a sister," he said. "She didn't make it." Natani crouched beside him. "You came to leave something?" The boy opened the satchel and pulled out a single piece of paper. A drawing, a child's hand, outlined in charcoal. Inside the palm, a bird. Wings open, head turned skyward. He placed it at the base of the stones. Clara didn't speak, but she moved the drawing slightly so it wouldn't catch the wind. They sat until the light thinned and the sky burned gold behind the ridge. The boy left, without asking for food. Just nodded once more and walked the road back toward the edge of the desert. That night, Clara carved another bird, smaller this time, but with more care. She sanded the edges with a stone, etched a faint line across the wings. She didn't rush, didn't speak. She just carved in silence, like he once did, like he'd shown her how to carry sorrow without letting it rot. By midsummer, the grave had become a place people came to without being told. They left things, small things, not flowers, but feathers, stones with carved marks, dried sage tied with thread, and once, a single strip of cloth stained with ochre, folded 12 times. No one spoke while they were there. Some stayed only minutes. Others stayed until the wind shifted. Clara never asked who they were. She just watched. One evening, she saw an old mescalero woman walk up the path barefoot, a worn shawl pulled tight. She sat beside the grave for almost an hour, her hands in her lap, then touched the ribbon once before leaving. When she passed Clara near the porch, she stopped just long enough to say, "He carried weight others feared to name." Clara nodded but said nothing. She had begun to understand that some burdens were shared in silence, not to be spoken, but carried together. Natani brought a message in early August. "A settlement further west," he said, sitting by the barn. "The children there are sick. They have no one." Mrs. Callahan wiped her hands on her apron. "And the fort? They won't come. Too far. Too poor." Clara stood at the doorway, silent. Later that night, she unfolded a scrap of paper she kept hidden in a crack near the windowsill. It held a crude list in pencil, names without last names, just firsts. Her mother's, a sister she never met, one she added weeks ago, the boy with the bird drawing. One more followed, the children who wait. Then she folded it again, tighter this time. The next morning, Clara packed the carving knife, 2 birds, and a strip of blanket she'd kept hidden. Not the whole piece, just a corner torn the night she was brought in. It still smelled faintly of pine and cold. Natani saw her tying a satchel closed. "You're leaving?" "Not forever," she said. "You're ready?" Clara looked toward the ridge, where the ribbon still moved gently, even when the air was still. He didn't wait to be ready. The mule was too old to travel far, she knew that, but she took it to the grave and placed her hand on its neck, resting there a long moment before whispering something only the animal heard. It blinked slowly and lowered its head. Then she turned to Mrs. Callahan. "I'll come back with stories." The woman didn't cry, only nodded and handed Clara a wrapped loaf of bread and a piece of smoked meat. "You walk like him now." Clara smiled. "I remember how he walked." The road west wasn't marked. It curved through red dirt and narrow canyons. Clara followed the sound of birds and the places where water left traces in stone. She slept in dry hollows, cooked by fire when she could, chewed raw roots when she couldn't. She spoke to no one unless spoken to first. At a creek, a man offered her a ride. She said no. When he asked where her people were, she said only, "Buried right." On the third day, she passed a boy sitting on a rock, crying quietly. She didn't ask what happened. She took a carved bird from her satchel and placed it beside him, then continued walking. After 5 days, she reached the edge of the sick camp. Children sat outside canvas tents, their eyes sunken but alert. A woman knelt by a boiling pot, wiping a cloth across a boy's forehead. Clara said nothing, just knelt, unwrapped the birds, and placed one beside the boy's sleeping mat. The other she gave to a girl with shaking hands. Then she picked up the pot and began to stir without being told. She stayed 5 nights, carved 3 more birds, taught 2 of the older children how to sand the edges without splitting the grain. When asked her name, she gave none, only a nod. "She walks like someone who's already walked farther than this," one woman said. "She doesn't flinch when children cough," said another. Before leaving, Clara gave one of the children the strip of blanket, folded small, tied with a thread of her own hair. "It's not magic," she said, "but it remembers warmth." The child held it like something sacred. When Clara returned to Dry Mesa, the ribbon was still there. The grave was clean. The mule had passed, quietly, beside the stones. Someone had buried it near him. No cross, just hoofprints in the dust. Clara stood still for a long time. Then she sat between the 2 resting places and took out her knife and began to carve. A new bird. But this one had no wings. It had feet, strong ones, planted, holding the earth. There was no marker, but those who knew where to walk always found their way. The path curved gently uphill, worn not by wheels or hooves, but by quiet feet, one after another, over weeks, seasons, years. Dust settled in the prints. Rain packed it down again. Grass leaned into the trail and leaned back with the wind. No signs, no names, just the feeling that if you listened long enough, something would speak without sound. Clara returned often, sometimes with bread, sometimes with carvings, sometimes only with silence. She no longer needed to explain where she'd been. When people saw her walking, they stepped aside, not from fear, from knowing. She moved through the land the way water moves through dry roots, invisible, but necessary. Years passed. She carved slower now, not from age, but from care. Each bird had a shape of its own, some with wings tucked, others mid-flight. She never repeated a design. When people asked to buy them, she refused. "They're not for shelves," she said once. "They're for hands that have lost something." Some were left in cradles, some in graves, some tucked into the corners of door frames where the wind whistled at night. She never signed them. One morning, a rider from the north brought word of a girl who had lived through fire. She wouldn't speak, he said, until someone gave her a wooden bird. Clara only nodded. The ribbon was gone one day. No one knew when. The tree still stood, the branch bare. Someone tied a string of braided grass in its place, not as a replacement but a continuation. Children added feathers, folded notes. Some wrote words, others drew hands. One left a small tin button, polished to mirror the sun. A man arrived once, dusty and limping, with eyes too tired to lie. He sat beside Clara at the stones, didn't speak, just placed a leather pouch on the ground between them. "It belonged to someone I wronged," he said. Clara didn't touch it, only looked at it a while, then nodded. He left without waiting for an answer. She buried the pouch beside the mule's resting place, placing a stone over it the size of her fist, not to hide it, just so it would stay. Sometimes she didn't carve at all, Some days were meant for listening. The wind had different tones in each season. In summer it rasped. In autumn it murmured. Winter brought back the silence she remembered best, the one that pressed against her when she first opened her eyes inside that blanket. In winter the fires burned longer, not brighter, just longer. She taught a few others how to cut the wood. Only those who didn't ask too many questions. She showed them how to trace the grain, how to hold the blade steady, even when the wood splintered. "This part's supposed to crack," she said once. "What do we do with the ones that break?" a girl asked. Clara turned one in her hand, the wing jagged and raw. "We keep them." One spring, when she was older than most believed, she walked farther than usual, west again, though her feet dragged slightly now. She carried only one thing, the first bird she'd ever carved, the crude one with the uneven beak and crooked tail. It had never been given away. She found a creek she remembered. The water was low, the trees taller. Nothing else had stayed. She buried the bird under a flat stone, pressed into the damp soil. Then she sat and listened to the sound of water brushing over rock, like breath through chapped lips. She didn't cry, only rested her hand over the earth, fingers curled slightly. The sun shifted. A shadow passed. A small bird landed near her foot, real, living, feathers pale with dust. It didn't sing, just stood there blinking, as if waiting for something. She stood slowly and walked home. When she no longer carved, others did. Not copies, never copies. But they remembered her hands, the way she measured silence, the way she nodded instead of naming pain. They left carvings not just in the desert, but in riverbeds, near school steps, beneath soldiers' graves, inside bags packed for leaving. No one called them hers. They didn't need to. Somewhere west of Dry Mesa, past the broken ridge and the old wind-bent tree, there's a place without fences. There are stones in the dirt, feathers tied to bark, and a single post with no name carved on it. Just a bird, feet planted, wings closed, and no one waiting for it to fly. One night, under a new moon, a boy arrived at the grave alone. Not a child, not a man, somewhere between. He walked with a limp that didn't come from injury but from uneven living, the kind shaped by hunger, and too many nights without a name called gently. He carried nothing in his hands, just a pouch tied around his neck with a single strip of red cloth. He sat where so many others had, beside the tree, near the stones, knees drawn in. He didn't speak, but his eyes stayed open long past dark, as if waiting not for someone, but for a memory that might remember him back. Before dawn, he untied the pouch. Inside, 3 broken carvings, scorched along the edges, all missing wings. He placed them at the base of the tree. Then, with a kind of reverence not taught but inherited, he took a small knife from his boot. Not new, not clean, but steady. He found a dry piece of cedar near the trail, knelt beside the grave, and began to carve, not skillfully, but with weight. When the morning light came, there was blood on his fingers, but the shape had formed. The bird he made didn't have a head, just a body, a shape enough to be known. He placed it beside the others and walked away. Far from Dry Mesa, under the lip of a sandstone cliff, an old woman built a small shelf from stone and bone. On it, she placed 5 birds, none identical. One was missing a wing. Another had been mended with string. Children came to see them. Not many, just those who heard things, whispers in the wind, or stories that weren't read from paper. The woman never told them what the birds were, only that if they listened long enough, they'd know which one was theirs. One girl picked the broken one. When asked why, she said, "It looks like it tried hardest." The woman smiled. "Then you understand. A letter once arrived at a town that didn't exist on any map. The envelope was stitched from canvas. No name, no return. Just a piece of carved wood tucked inside, shaped like a feather. On the underside, faintly scratched, were the words, 'Keep it moving.' No one claimed it, but it stayed on the sheriff's desk for years. When he died, it went into the hands of the next, and then the next. None of them dared throw it away. One winter, a young man lost in the northern canyons followed a trail of carved birds strung with rawhide. He didn't know who placed them. He only knew that they kept appearing, tied to tree branches, wedged between rocks, tucked into dry cracks in canyon walls. When he collapsed from cold, someone found him with a bird clutched in his hand, curled to his chest. They never figured out who left the trail. They never asked too loudly. And so the carvings continued, not from legend, but from grief made visible. From the kind of healing that never says its name, only offers its shape. One wing at a time, sometimes bent, sometimes lost, sometimes never attached at all, but always left behind. Not for display, for those who still had walking to do.